Resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question is the bill will now be read a second time. I'll give the call in continuation to the honourable member for Deakin.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And before the 90-second statements, I read out the exhaustive list of amendments, and so I move the second reading amendment that has been circulated in my name. And, Mr Speaker, in those amendments, I made clear that, whilst not declining to give this a second reading, that this bill sadly needs to be seen in the context of the absolute disaster that has fallen on vulnerable communities throughout this country as a result of the ideological position that this government has taken with respect to abolishing the compulsory cashless debit card. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've seen evidence, clear, irrefutable evidence, just as recently on the weekend, evidence, South Australia police statistics that show since the cashless debit card, the compulsory nature of it, was abolished by the Labor government in respect of Ceduna, crime has doubled. Crime has doubled in that time. Now, in a debate not too dissimilar to this last year, when the government applauded themselves when they abolished the cashless debit card, we were very clear with the government that the human misery that would follow the abolition of the cashless debit card was not theoretical. It wasn't us making a political point. I pleaded with the government, do not do this. If you do this, if you abolish the cashless debit card, as sure as night follows day, we will see alcohol and drugs flood into vulnerable communities. And you don't have to be Einstein, or you don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to sit at the dinner parties that those members of the government sit at with their high-minded discussions to know that if you allow vulnerable communities to be flooded with more drugs and alcohol, the dysfunction in those communities will go through the roof. Didn't need to be a genius to work that out, Madam Deputy Speaker. And yet the government went ahead with it anyway. And now we see the statistics don't lie. The statistics out of Ceduna, South Australian police statistics show crime has doubled. Madam Deputy Speaker, I was in a meeting this morning, in fact, with members, community leaders from Western Australia in the Goldfields and Kimberley regions of Western Australia who have got cashless debit card or had compulsory cashless debit cards previously. We had the member for Grey there as well, and all of the members that represent cashless debit card sites. And it was story after story that just confirmed the statistics, that towns that were, in the case of Ceduna, towns that had seen a resurgence in tourism, had been seeing great harmony since the cashless debit card has been put in place, has now seen that degenerate, seen it absolutely degenerate. And the point I always make, Madam Deputy Speaker, in this debate is, and this is the heartbreaking thing, and it really is, and I'm not known for my sentimentality in this House. I'm not known for my sentimentality generally. But I must say, the things that do tug on my heartstrings, as a father, as a husband, is when I see the outcome of this decision from the government leading to women and children suffering. And I always make this point, and I think I'm a bit more generous to the government than they are to the opposition. I always make this point. No one in this chamber wants to see people suffer. So it beggars belief that the government would put in place a policy that they know with certainty will lead to women and children suffering. More drugs and alcohol flooding into these communities hurts the women and children the most. And today, in our meeting with community leaders, including an Indigenous leader from Western Australia in the Goldfields region, he remarked on how now we see children coming to school again having not eaten, there being no food at home, relying more and more on the school system to try and help them through. Whereas when the cashless debit card was in place, a huge improvement had been seen because welfare recipients who were subject to the cashless debit card on a compulsory fashion were forced to use 80% of their welfare for staple everyday goods. Goods you'd find at a supermarket, not to go and spend at the bottle shop, not to go and spend at the pub, and now we see that money now being spent at the bottle shop and the pub. So how anyone in good conscience could go ahead with that policy, because if you've got a brain, you know that more drugs and alcohol is going to have that consequence. We now see the human misery and the suffering that's resulted from it. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is a very narrow bill in that it helps transition people from old CDC technology, from old basics card technology, effectively, for those who are on the compulsory basics card in the Northern Territory, to the updated technology that was the CDC technology. So those opposite criticised the former government for the cashless debit card, and yet now are utilising the cashless debit card technology that we had in place on a compulsory basis that they've turned voluntary. They're now transitioning everybody in the Northern Territory on the basics card to that cashless debit card, the technology of which we developed. So, on one hand, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are so utterly appalled by what the government has done here on the CDC that at first inclination you'd say, don't support anything the government does in this space. They have so tarnished themselves, they have so tarnished these communities that we shouldn't support anything that they do in the cashless debit card space. But if we were to take that position, we would deny people on the basics card in the Northern Territory the better functionality of the cashless debit card, which was the card that we had in place. That was the card that the opposition at the time criticised and said it was terrible. Well, now they're using our technology to transition it to those who are on compulsory income management in the Northern Territory. So in that sense, we will place above my deep disgust, to be frank, of what the government has done here, we will place their interests above that deep disgust that we feel. And subject to my amendments, which I've circulated, we will not deny those recipients of the updated card. Now, it's worth mentioning a couple of things in relation to the so-called smart card. The smart card is a rebranded cashless debit card. That's all it is. And all you have to do is look at some of the providers of those cards and what they've said about the updated card, a card which has cost $217 million. Now, this card, as the traditional credit union explains to its cardholders, says the differences between the CDC and the new smart card are, hold your breath, the differences between the CDC and the new smart card are its colour and its name. Its colour and its name.
That's a big deal.
That's what $217 million gets you under a Labor government. You change the colour and you change the name. Now, why would you do that, Madam Deputy Speaker? Why would you spend $217 million to take the technology that's already there, that was developed by the Coalition, rename it something else, the smart card, but all the change is the colour and the name. Okay, keep up to the minister. You've lost track. I'll take the interjection. The CDC that was in place, which was criticised by you, criticised by the government when in opposition, is now the technology which underpins the so-called smart card that's cost $217 million in the middle of a cost of living crisis. So someone's done pretty well out of it. Some consultants made a whole lot of money out of renaming it from cashless debit card to smart card and updating the colour. Let's see what that contract looks like, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Might have had a design consultant.
But notwithstanding that absolute appalling disregard of taxpayers' money, at least those who are on the basics card in the Northern Territory will now get access to the updated technology that the Coalition developed with the cashless debit card. And in that respect, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will not stand in the way. But what we also won't do, Madam Deputy Speaker, is speak down to these communities. The Prime Minister in question time, flailing around for an answer. Detail is not his strong suit, as we all know. The person who couldn't name the cash rate or the unemployment rate on the first day of the election, which I think says it all about his ability to master detail. What we won't do, though, is speak down to those communities. Now, you've got a delegation of people from cashless debit card sites, community leaders, Indigenous leaders, saying, reinstate the cashless debit card. We are suffering the consequences of this decision from your government. Please reinstate the card and, at the very least, help us. Help us deal with the dysfunction, the violence, the alcoholism that we're now seeing. But sadly, what we've seen from those opposite, from the minister, from the assistant minister, from the Prime Minister, is this talking to or talking down to communities rather than listening to them. Now, at a time when we're talking a lot about the voice and people's voices, you've got to listen to people's voices in these communities who are suffering. And so I was very disappointed when I saw, speaking to the ABC Goldfields on the 15th of February, the Assistant Social Services Minister basically said that communities were being disingenuous in their criticism of the government, in their criticisms of the government repealing the CDC. Now, I sincerely hope that the government's walked those statements back because, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wouldn't want to be out there as a minister criticising those who are on the front line, mopping up after the mess that's been created by this government. Mopping up. And I mean literally mopping up. I mean carrying drunken people who are in the street, helping them find safety. I mean the emergency services and the police who are there to mop up with the increased violence including violence against women and children, things that we are seeing borne out in official South Australian police statistics. These aren't my statistics. Sure, when the government abolished the cashless debit card, I said in this chamber that human misery would follow. But the government had at least the argument to say, well, that's just your assertion, Shadow Minister. That's just an assertion. You don't know that for sure, even though, again, you don't need to be a particular genius to work out that more drugs and alcohol in vulnerable communities will lead to that. but they at least had that very flimsy ground to stand on. Now they have none of that, because it's not my assertion anymore. These are the official police statistics. Crime has doubled in Ceduna. What does the government not understand about that? Crime has doubled in Ceduna since you abolished the cashless debit card. Doubled. Not up by 10%, not up by 20%. It has doubled. So again, I appeal to good people in the Labor Party. I appeal to good people in the Labor Party. There's an off-ramp for you here. And I think Australian people give you more credit, even as a government, when you admit mistakes. Walk back from this catastrophic error. And as I said to the Social Services Minister across the chamber, and I'll say it on Hansard, if the government reverses its decision to abolish compulsory cashless debit card in each of the sites, I will be the first person to march into this chamber, seek the call from the Speaker and unreservedly congratulate the Social Services Minister, the Assistant Minister and the Prime Minister on at least admitting that they made a catastrophic error. Because every government makes mistakes. The test of a good government is when you recognise that the cost of that mistake is too great. And I wouldn't want to be going home at night putting my head on the pillow knowing that a decision taken by this government is leading to more crime, including violent crime in vulnerable communities. I can't say it strongly enough, because this pig-headedness, letting politics get in the way, is, quite frankly, what can be the worst thing about politics in this country. This pig-headed decision to just ride it through, ride it out, don't worry about the people that suffer along the way, because we don't want to suffer the embarrassment or indignation of admitting we made the wrong call. Well, I can commit today, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I will not come to this dispatch box and crow and say, you should have listened to us from day one, we had it right, you didn't need to be a genius to know that more drugs and alcohol into these communities was going to increase crime and make women and children suffer more. I won't say any of that. I will unreservedly congratulate the government for admitting its error. And I think we would all walk away from here feeling, you know what, there's a few women and a few children who are a bit safer tonight because there's less drugs and less alcohol in these vulnerable communities. And let's be frank, that's what we're talking about today. There is a range of other problems here, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government doesn't know or won't, or just won't say, we're not really sure, when the transition will commence. So we won't stand in the way of this bill. Our support will be the thing that allows it to pass the parliament, let's be frank. I don't think it's likely that the crossbench will, certainly the Greens political party will support this. So our support is crucial to ensuring that this happens. So I think the least the government can do is commit to when it will commence. Last year, the government's regulation impact statement stated that current income management participants will continue to use the Basics card and move to a new card with enhanced functionality from the 1st of July 2023. Has the minister repeated this timeline since? I might ask the House. No. No, the minister has not repeated that declaration that this will take place from the 1st of July 2023. In fact, the EM to the bill omits altogether any firm timelines. So instead, what members are being asked to vote on, without the aid of a new regulatory impact statement, is a vague commencement date outlined in the bill's EM. The minister has not bothered to tell the parliament, much less some of the most vulnerable Australians who will be affected by this decision, when the transition will commence. So the minister will need to explain, or the assistant minister, as the case may be, why 1 July 2023 is no longer the government's stated transition date. When did the government know that that would no longer be the transition date? And why are they treating Australians with contempt by not even outlining what the transition date will be? I mean, they took this abominable policy to an election. They've been in government now for 10 months. They committed to a 1 July 2023, transition date. And yet we don't know anything about that. I'll restate our position, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have moved the amendment circulated in my name, which won't stop the progress of this bill as far as the opposition is concerned. I want to hear from the minister who speaks on this bill when the transition date will be. Whilst we're not going to stand in the way of the bill, the least the government can do is outline to us, if not the Australian people, when the transition date is. Not a fluffy timeline, not a range, a date. A date. When will this transition occur, particularly for those who are on the Basics card, who will be able to get the increased functionality of the Coalition's cashless debit card, which is now being rebranded at a cost of $217 million, new colour and new name, rebranded by the government. And then I would just finally say again, Madam Deputy Speaker, I appeal to the government. It's not too late to reinstate the compulsory nature of the CDC in each of the sites where it was working exceptionally well. If you don't believe me, believe the community representatives from the Goldfields or the Kimberley or Ceduna and other parts of Australia who have seen a tsunami of drugs and alcohol causing huge crime problems in their communities. And it's not some sort of fluffy time frame. What we've seen is crime statistics since the card was abolished double. The number of crimes double. And we talk about crime. You know, I use the word crime. I'm as guilty as anyone just using the anodised word of crime. Well, what is crime? What are the crimes we're talking about? We're talking about public disorder. We're talking about crimes against property, whether that be a broken window or a fight in the street. But we're also talking about horrific violent crime. We're also talking about domestic violence, quite frankly. We're talking about neglect of children. And if these things don't tug the heartstrings of the hardest person in this House, I don't know what can. So I appeal to the government one last time. We will facilitate in any way, shape or form the government reinstating the compulsory cashless debit card to help the communities who are now seeing a tsunami of crime, of drugs and alcohol into their towns, who are grappling with that. We will facilitate in any way you admitting that you've made a catastrophic error, and I will commend you for walking it back. I will commend you for admitting that error. And I think in the end, politically, Australians will give credit to a government who admits that they have made a catastrophic decision that has led to a disaster for these communities, and particularly a disaster for women and children. So I'll restate it. We won't be opposing this bill. We won't be opposing particularly people in the Northern Territory who are on compulsory income management, the Basics card, from getting access to the better functionality that the government has adopted and rebranded for these purposes. But it in no way means that we walk away from our vehement opposition of this ideological and destructive decision by the government to abolish the compulsory cashless debit card.
Is the amendment seconded?